I've been schooled in the art of science fiction, the science of science fiction, if you like. Everything we are now has its seeds 20 years ago. Computing, television, satellites, all of that stuff was starting to occur. And for me, it was a matter of extrapolating those trends into a future. The premise of Max Headroom is a world 20 minutes into the future, which is ruled by corporations and governed by television, in which truth is a commodity in short supply, and in which one individual, in this instance Edison Carter, is out there to make a difference. I grew up in the country, on a farm, in the middle of Norfolk, with no running water and no electricity. I hated cows, I hated mud, and I hated the sheer primitive nature of how we lived. And so I fell in love with the future. I fell in love with science fiction, I suppose, at the age of 7, 8 or 9. I was reading Isaac Asimov, and of course all the John Campbell astounding stuff. To say that I was a fan of science fiction is a bit of an understatement. I'd immersed myself in it for years. There are two basic strands in SF, or there were at the time that I was writing. There is the American strand, which is concerned with outer space, alien planets, the conquest. And that goes back, I suppose, to the frontier myth that persists in American society. In Britain, in the UK, it's slightly different. We are, as J.G. Ballard says, the only alien planet is Earth. We like the notion of the cosy English catastrophe. We like the idea of inner space. And so that idea of the mind as being an interesting area to work in very, very heavily informed the world of Max and 20 Minutes into the Future. An enormous problem that I faced was, how can you program a person? How can you make a human consciousness out of a mechanism, out of a machine? We're talking early 80s now. And the first home computers are coming out. The world those machines opened up was fascinating. And the world that I fell into was the world of adventure games. An adventure game is interactive fiction. It's a story. It happens entirely in words. The words unfold on the screen. As you type, you make decisions. You move your character, your avatar. You move your avatar through this world, and you're faced with various challenges. And if it's well written, then you're there. It's fantastic. So the notion of using a computer to communicate with a character, and the notion of a character existing inside a machine, kind of came at the same time. But you're still faced with the same question. How do I create a consciousness? Can I create a consciousness? And I wrestled with this. This took a long while. There's science fiction where what you're writing is based on fact, it's based on what we know, it's an extrapolation from what we know into a what if. And there's fantasy. And fantasy doesn't ask those questions at all, it merely goes for effect. And therefore, those questions had to be got right. How do you get a consciousness into a machine? I don't think today, and I don't think in the future, we will replicate what goes on in the human mind. There are far too many connections, there's far too much going on, and when we think about language and how we acquire language, how I'm able to speak, how you're able to understand it, this is almost miraculous. It's as though our brains are designed to understand language. that language is kind of built in. In order to get to a working consciousness inside a machine, the only way to do that was to copy a human mind. So if I wanted a computer-generated character in a virtual world, I would need a way to get a human mind into that world. And that's why Edison Carter hits the gate arm, has his consciousness copied, and wakes up amnesiac in a world that consists solely of television. Imagine this: a consciousness, a human consciousness, with no memory of anything, with no sense of sensation, with no knowledge of self, but which is suddenly exposed to 10,000 simultaneous channels of TV. It's going to make you a bit mad, but it's also, you're going to think that what you're seeing is, this is what I am. What emerges from Ed's consciousness is this notion of a character who is entirely in that television world. He has no sensory memory at all. He has no notion of where he's come from. Max Headroom is every talking head you ever saw. Max Headroom is every televangelist, every sports reporter, every news reporter. He is an amalgam of them all. The language, the words that he uses skip and flip from one to the other. I'd like to thank the Wachowski brothers for a wonderful phrase: residual self-image. Max's residual self-image grows from his experience of television. His consciousness grows from his experience of television. He has all the wiring of a human mind, but none of the memories. The essential test of artificial intelligence, is this entity intelligent, was devised by a man called Alan Turing, who is the father of computing. The question that Turing put up was, if you're given a terminal and you're typing at a terminal and you're getting replies, if you can't tell whether you're talking to a machine or a person, and it turns out you're talking to a machine, if you can't tell it's a machine, then you must judge that machine to be intelligent. That's the Turing test. And I believe that every year there is a competition to see whether a machine can pass the Turing test. So far, it hasn't happened. The reason it hasn't happened is because intelligence and language are so intertwined. What we call intelligence is, in its most refined form, is language use. The fact that we can understand each other at all just by making noises, the fact that I can put any thought into your head, rhinoceros, and there's the rhinoceros, by just using symbols, a few words, nothing, and yet suddenly, elephant, you see, it's there. This is what intelligence is. Intelligence isn't the ability to mouth words. It's the ability to put meaning behind those words so that we all communicate. Will a machine ever be intelligent? I don't think so. We may be able to fake it. We may be able to fool people. It may be that we will have artificial call centers where voice recognition enables a great deal of sophistication. But ultimately, I don't think machines will ever get there. That doesn't mean we should stop trying at all, because in trying to find out what it is that makes us human, one of the best ways to do that is to try and copy it and find out, okay, and the areas that make us human are getting smaller and smaller, but humanity ain't going to vanish entirely, and the machines won't take over. My main intention, right at the very core of Max and his world, was to get people to question the process of television, to understand that behind the screen there is a consciousness and an agenda, and that that agenda might not always be on your side. What is news? Who says what? Who says what stories go where? These processes that inform you aren't neutral. They may not be in your best interests. So I'd like to think that Max Headroom helped people wise up to what they were seeing, to see that news and information isn't neutral. It comes from somewhere. It is filtered through a particular mesh, and that mesh will only let certain ideas through. Other things will be filed away. So Edison Carter is a man who wants to find out the truth. He works against corporate interests and in the interest of truth. Whether the journalists we have on the ground now are as pure of heart, let's watch television this evening and find out.